Clements Center's events for this semester. My name is Paul Miller. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at UT. Happy to see you here. As many of you know, the mission of the Clements Center is to train the next generation of national security leaders. We do that through a variety of events on campus, book talks, conferences, and symposia, and other student programs. One of the main ways we do this is by bringing people to campus who have knowledge or experience in national security affairs. We bring them to share their experience and expertise with the university community. And so I'm happy to introduce today James Kirchick. James Kirchick is a journalist and a foreign correspondent currently based in Washington, D.C. He's a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative in D.C., a think tank on foreign affairs. He started out as a journalist with the New Republic, where he covered domestic politics, lobbying, intelligence, American foreign policy, and other issues for over 3 years. Then he moved to Europe, and based out of Prague, he wrote and reported for a variety of publications and media outlets, including Radio Free Europe, published in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and so forth. So basically, he lived in Europe, wandered around, and then wrote things. So clearly, I'm doing something wrong with my career. He's figured it out. So we're very happy to have Jamie here. He's just published his first book, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, published by Yale University Press. And it will be available in that back corner at the conclusion of this talk. If you'd like to buy a copy and ask him to sign it, it'll be available for that afterwards. So we're very grateful to have you. Please join me in giving Jamie a welcome.
Thank you, Paul, for that very kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Will and Bowden and the Clements Center for hosting me here. I was a graduate of Yale's Grand Strategy program, and I know that this center takes a lot of inspiration from that, so it's very good to see it's being such a successful program. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of populist nationalism. Ideologically indeterminate, it manifests across the continent in a variety of forms, whether it be France's right-wing National Front, the post-communist German Left Party, or the Italian Five Star Movement, which defies any customary ideological political label. While these parties and the intellectual currents to which they give voice may not align on everything, they are invariably anti-establishment, skeptical of the European Union, and hostile to America. They are also all supported, either materially or through other less tangible instruments, by Russia. This is not incidental. As Europe's political stability, social cohesion, economic prosperity, and security are more threatened today than at any point since the Cold War, Russia is destabilizing the continent on every front. Indigenous factors, whether long extant nationalism, design flaws in the Eurozone, lack of a common foreign policy, or the inability to assimilate immigrants, certainly lay at the root of these multiple crises. But they are all exploited by Moscow and exacerbated by its malign influence. Fomenting European disintegration from within, Russia also presents a threat from without, in the form of its massive military buildup, frequent intimidation of NATO members, and efforts to overturn the continent's security architecture by weakening the transatlantic link with the United States. Yet just at the moment when the West requires unity, it is disintegrating. Brexit foretells the potential demise of the European Union, a democratic bulwark, to Russia's predatory strategy of divide and rule. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Americans have chosen a president who abjures his country's traditional role as linchpin of the liberal world order and wishes to ally with the very power threatening to dismantle it, although with the events of the past week, who knows if that's still going to happen. Unlike any American president of the post-war age, Donald Trump's 19th century worldview seems to accord with a Russian sphere of interest in Europe. For the next 4 years at least, it is an open question whether there will be any American leadership to corral Europeans against Russian aggression and subversion. On the contrary, President Trump speaks of wanting to gain Moscow's partnership in pivoting back to the Middle East, a strategic realignment that may sacrifice European security as the cost of Russian collaboration. The title of my book references not the dissolution of the European Union or something so catastrophic as a war, though these are real, if remote, possibilities, but rather something more ethereal and imaginable. The slow, gradual reversion of the European state of nature, the slow, gradual reversion to the European state of nature prior to the post-war integration project, and the rise of amoral, prostrate, nationalist governments in Europe that no longer project the liberal values upon which the Euro-Atlantic community is grounded, and that are willing to engage in a purely transactional relationship with Russia. Should the end of Europe I presage come to pass, it will be the fault of apathetic Europeans, absent Americans, and aggressive Russians. Now, unlike during the Cold War, Russia today seeks not the military and political domination of Europe through the advance of the Red Army or the spread of communist ideology, but rather a resetting of the continent's security architecture. The Kremlin tries to achieve this through meddling in European and American politics so as to install governments acquiescent to its primary objective, supplanting the values-driven, rules-based international system with what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently called at the Munich Security Conference a, quote, post-Western world order, wherein might makes right. In this order, the countries along Russia's periphery will be forced to accept limited sovereignty. Moscow seeks nothing less than a reversal of the momentous historical processes begun in 1989, when Central and Eastern Europeans peacefully reclaimed their freedom after decades of Russian-imposed tyranny. Because the European Union and NATO are obstacles in this reassertion of Russian hegemony, Moscow's long-term strategy is to undermine and ultimately break these institutions from within, thereby neutralizing the concert of nations that has traditionally been necessary to restrain Russian expansion on the European continent. The Kremlin's ideal outcome is the Finlandization of the West, whereby Europe and America abandon their principles, sacrifice their allies, and accommodate themselves to Kremlin prerogatives without Russia having to dispatch a single soldier abroad. In Western Europe today, through hybrid warfare tactics of disinformation, hacking, leaking, and the spread of corruption, Russia hopes to achieve by non-violent means what the Soviet Union once did in Eastern Europe through force of arms, that is, overthrow democratic governments. For a West that is divided, inert, and unsure of its own basic values is not one that will challenge Russia's revisionist agenda. If a peaceful and prosperous Europe is a core national security interest of the United States, and it has been for the past 80 years, the Russian regime is one to be resisted and contained. For none of the existential problems Europe faces will dissipate until the revanchist power to its east is quelled. The road to a Europe whole, free, and at peace, in other words, goes through Moscow. Across the West, Russia is pushing on open doors, exploiting fears over Islam, economic inertia, and anxieties wrought by globalization to nudge Western publics in a more Russia-sympathetic direction. Finally attuned to the particular grievances of a diverse array of Western constituencies, Russian narratives find fertile ground in Europe, where resentment over the Iraq War, fallout from the 2008 financial crisis, fears over the challenges brought by Muslim immigrants, and revelations of National Security Agency surveillance continue to breed discontent with the political establishment. Beginning with President Trump, many Western leaders have difficulty accepting the strategic necessity of treating Moscow like the pariah it is. They labor under the illusion that it's our own hubris, our arrogant post-Cold War imposition of security and political arrangements on an emasculated post-Soviet Russia that's primarily standing in the way of good relations and not Russian revisionism and aggression. This credulity extends, I might add, to the previous administration, many of whose members have suddenly awoken to the paramount threat Russia poses to our security and values, and who are engaging in a bit of selective amnesia regarding their own solicitousness to Moscow, while today condemning the current president for his promises to get along with Russia. Like the titular leader of the free world, a fair number of European political elites stuck in a mindset that still considers Russia a potential partner, bend over backwards to explain Russian conduct as the predictable and not entirely unjustified reaction of an encircled power whose interests must be respected. They counsel us to bend the rules of the international liberal order to the claims of a revisionist power that wants to overturn it completely. To paraphrase Leon Trotsky, the West may not seek conflict with Russia, but Russia seeks conflict with the West. That is because the Putin regime cannot exist alongside a democratic Europe willing to stand up for its principles. Moscow sees liberal democracy as a threat and therefore must defeat it, either by force of arms in Ukraine or an attempted coup in Montenegro several months ago, or via nonviolent means in the West, dragging us down to their own level through the export of kleptocracy, disinformation, and support for nationalist and disruptive political movements and social forces. Shorn of Marxist-Leninism, the Kremlin today is driven by an ideologically versatile illiberalism, willing to work with any political faction amenable to its destructive aims. Whereas once Moscow allied with local communists and fellow travelers, now it also counts upon a growing number of sympathizers on the right. Russia has reverted to its place as, in the words of the writer Paul Berman, the historical center of world reaction, headquarters of the new counter-enlightenment. The avatar of the Kremlin-friendly conservative leader in Europe is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who over the past quarter century has undergone one of the more remarkable transformations in European politics, from that of a liberal, anti-communist firebrand to Vladimir Putin's closest ally in the European Union. Despite being the leader of a proud nation brutally invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union, Orban is the most vocal internal opponent of EU sanctions placed on Russia over its meddling in Ukraine, which is itself a neighbor of Hungary. Orban also aligns with the Kremlin on a more profound level, championing what he calls illiberal democracy, and most recently, ethnic homogeneity, as well as echoing Russian promulgated narratives on Western decline and the threat posed to Europe from an undifferentiated Islamic peril. The embrace of Putin by Western leaders like Trump, Orban, and Marine Le Pen is the culmination of Moscow's assiduous, years-long cultivation of the global political right. One of the most potent narratives that Russia has weaponized in this regard is that of a Judeo-Christian civilization under siege from a rising Muslim threat. As fears of demographic and societal change have taken hold over parts of Europe, traditionally most resistant to Russian meddling, like Central and Eastern Europe, Russia has subtly insinuated itself into Western politics to an extent unprecedented since the collapse of the Soviet Union, finding allies in the unlikeliest of places. That the issue of Islam in Europe has been exploited by Russia, however, should not prevent us from having an honest conversation about its challenges, as all too many European elites tend to do. A recent poll commissioned by the British think tank Chatham House found that over half of respondents in 8 out of 10 European countries it polled support an outright ban on all immigration from Muslim countries, the exact same position, a very controversial position, that Donald Trump took during his campaign. Now, this shocking figure, I would argue, demonstrates a massive gap between the lofty language of European elites and the citizens that they govern. And to ensure that this gap does not grow, and that the populists espousing such views do not one day come to power, the Western political mainstream needs to create the space for an inclusive liberal nationalism that is capable of addressing questions about the place of Islam in European societies, so that the cause of national identity is not hijacked by unscrupulous demagogues like the National Front, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, or the Alternative for Germany Party, a far-right party in Germany. Tackling the problem of parallel societies, banning the full Islamic face veil, or even lowering migration levels from some Muslim-majority countries, if mere discussion of these issues is treated as a concession to fascism, then it is the fascists, I'm afraid, who will reap the benefits. A powerful vector Russia blends in its informational warfare is migration, the consequences of which threaten the future of the European project perhaps more than any other crisis. Russia's military intervention in Syria in support of the Assad regime, as well as its recent support for the warlord ruling eastern Libya, have created what the Russian political analyst Leonid Fortuny calls a crescent of instability around Europe, running the length of northern Africa to the Levant and all the way up to the Baltic Sea. Having colluded in the conditions driving massive numbers of migrants to Europe through its support of the Assad regime, Moscow then weaponizes their presence on the continent by aiding and abetting the xenophobic populist movements. Long before the term fake news was on everybody's lips here in the United States, Moscow ginned up the infamous Lisa case in Germany, wherein Russian state media falsely alleged that a gang of immigrant Muslim men had raped an ethnic Russian girl. In response to Brexit, the American election, and the rise of populists across Europe, many in the West are beginning to question the assumptions upon which the post-war liberal order stands. While introspection is necessary, we do not need to rethink first principles. Protectionism remains wrong, both morally and economically. NATO remains the bedrock of our security, no matter how many times certain individuals call it obsolete. The post-war international system has benefited America enormously. It is not a ripoff. Minister Lavrov's call for a post-Western world order is nothing new. Russians have frequently floated proposals aimed at diluting the Western-led international system by incorporating a non-democratic Russia into its structures. Increasingly, however, these calls for reassessing the liberal world order are finding an audience on this side of the ocean, where voices posit that it has outlived its usefulness. In a combination of astonishing historical illiteracy and sinister prophecy, the president's senior counselor says that he wants to make the world, quote, as exciting as the 1930s, unquote, and that strong nationalist movements in countries make strong neighbors. The ineluctable logic of nationalist movements, of course, in Europe is that they will inevitably conflict. French industrial policy of the sort endorsed by Marine Le Pen cannot work alongside Germany's export-driven economy, which in turn, the Nationalist Alternative for Germany party would weaken by dropping Germany's membership in the euro. Meanwhile, a leading figure in what passes for the pro-Trump intellectual movement, who now serves as a high-ranking national security official in this administration, asks of NATO, quote, what is the alliance for once its original purpose has evaporated? The original purpose of NATO was, to quote the first Secretary General of NATO, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. With the exception of that last part about Germany, whose neighbors wanted to play a more assertive role in continental defense and security, the founding rationale for the Atlantic Alliance endures. The fundamentals remain. The arrangements we have are working. They need strengthening, not a redesign. For over 70 years, the transatlantic alliance has been the bedrock of American foreign policy. Presidents of both parties, from Harry Truman to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, all supported a politically and economically integrated Europe bound to the United States by shared democratic values, robust trade, and a military alliance founded upon the principle of collective security. This transatlantic bond has been sustained largely through two organizations, the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. By first protecting Western Europe from Soviet aggression and then, after the Cold War ended, integrating Eastern Europe into its security architecture, NATO is rightfully regarded as the most successful military alliance in history. The EU, meanwhile, for all its problems, has benefited America by providing a unified market for our business and consolidated the continent's diverse nation-states into a fellow democratic geopolitical power. It is no exaggeration to say that the European project has been America's most successful foreign policy achievement, helping to ensure unprecedented peace and prosperity on a continent once racked by total war, genocide, and economic privation. In the form of Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, a massive migrant crisis, stubbornly low economic growth, rising Islamic terrorism and anti-Semitism, political disintegration in the form of Brexit, and the rise of illiberal populist movements across the continent, Europe is facing a series of challenges that collectively pose its greatest crisis since the start of the Cold War. Donald Trump, I'm afraid, may aggravate these tensions by destabilizing Europe from within and without. By supporting Great Britain's departure from the EU and encouraging other states to follow its lead, Trump's opposition to European integration breaks with over 7 decades of US foreign policy tradition. In a recent joint interview with the London Times and Germany's Bild newspaper, Trump disparaged the EU, echoing right-wing nationalist claims that it amounts to, quote, other people coming in and destroying their country. Asked about the future of the EU, Trump responded, "I don't really care whether it's separate or together. To me, it doesn't matter." As for NATO, what most seems to annoy Trump is its supposed cost to the American taxpayer. The crux of the president's complaint, as is the case with his position on nearly every issue, is that the United States is getting a bad deal out of its NATO membership. Now, it's true that Washington pays more than its fair share of NATO's overall budget, about 75%, and that the United States is one of only 3 or 4 members to spend the recommended 2% of its GDP on defense. Trump acts, however, as if he's the first person to point out America's disproportionate NATO expenditure, when this is a conundrum that has confronted American defense planners since the NATO-Washington Treaty was signed 67 years ago. Last year in Germany, for instance, President Obama complained that sometimes Europe has been complacent about its own defense, and he had earlier referred to US allies derisively as being free riders. But Trump is the first to suggest that our treaty obligations under the alliance's Mutual Defense Pact, Article 5, be conditioned upon members, quote, paying their bills. Now, understanding an alliance like NATO solely in monetary terms misses its purpose completely. Take a country like Denmark, which, like most NATO members, does not spend the recommended 2% of its GDP on defense. And I should point out that this 2% number is to be spent by 2024. It's a future target, and so countries are not technically in violation of this by not spending 2% now. It's a goal to meet by 2024. So Denmark spends less than 2%. Yet more Danish soldiers died per capita as part of the NATO mission in Afghanistan, undertaken in solidarity with the United States after terrorist attacks committed on our soil, and I would add the first and only time that NATO's collective security clause has ever been invoked, than any other alliance member. Surely that sacrifice in blood should count for at least as much as expenditures in cash. Yes, European countries ought to spend more for their own defense, not merely out of respect for the American taxpayer, but also for their own good. But this obsession with money fails to account for the true value of the Atlantic Alliance, which lies beyond the financial contributions of its members. Today, thanks in no small part to NATO, Europe is home to countries that both share our democratic values and are some of our biggest trading partners. In treating foreign relations like a protection racket, whereby nations seeking our friendship must pay tribute, the President fails to comprehend both the nature and the function of alliances, namely how they're valuable regardless of whatever monetary benefit they accrue. For how does one possibly enumerate the dollar value of something so intangible as the liberal world order, a vast system of security, trade, and diplomatic arrangements maintained by the forward deployment of American military forces and an interlocking web of institutions, treaties, and customs? We take this international system for granted because its advantages are return on investment, as Donald Trump might put it, manifest themselves in an absence of the political destabilization and armed conflict that plague other parts of the world, as opposed to the more tangible benefit of, say, a tax cut. Dependable alliances are a force multiplier for the United States, allowing us to achieve international goals that would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish on our own. Having soldiers deployed overseas, for example, allows us to project our power, deters adversaries, and is far less costly and logistically complex than shipping them out every time the US needs to dispatch soldiers somewhere for a crisis. To avert catastrophe, it is imperative that the United States pivot back to Europe. For all the hype about a rising Asia, Europe is America's most important ally with whom we share values and interests. Abandoning Europe at this time would create a political and security vacuum on the continent, one that would inevitably be filled by Russia. While Russia today may not be nearly as strong a power as it was during the Cold War in any conventional sense, the threat it poses is more diffuse. In a globalized world where the cancerous influence of Russian money and disinformation can more easily corrupt us than when an iron curtain divided the continent, and where the ideological terrain is more confusing than the Cold War's rigid bipolarity between the communist East and the capitalist West. Containing Russia presents different challenges than it did a generation ago, not the least of which is maintaining Western unity against a more ambiguous adversary skilled at fighting asymmetrically. Never during the Cold War, for instance, was there such a traumatic break within the Western political alliance as Britain's departure from the European Union, nor for that matter did an overtly pro-Russian politician ever capture the presidency of the United States. A genuinely democratic Russia would feel no threat from Europe and thus lack the impulse to debase and disrupt it. But to be sure, the illiberal movements currently roiling the EU would exist regardless of Russia. Anyone remotely familiar with the continent's history knows that Europeans do not require outside instigation to support destructive forces like nationalism. But only absent the revisionist regime in Moscow is a Europe whole, free, and at peace remotely possible. Thank you.